Hi everybody, welcome to our webinar. It's not just a pipe dream. We are this evening, this afternoon, whichever time zone that you're currently in, we're just going to be having a quick talk around pipe dream, the threats that we're facing in defending in critical infrastructure, and talking a little bit about some of the good practice that we're seeing out there and how we can go about trying to solve some of the problems. So without any further delay, I'd just like to pass over to the rest of the panelists to introduce themselves.
Yeah, perfect. And obviously, David Bianco was not on the agenda, but when Ryan came over to my house, David appeared, and we had some barbecue and had some fun. And David's a brilliant individual. I'll let him introduce himself for those of you who don't know him, but he's going to join us anyways. But I'm Rob Lee. I'm the CEO and co-founder over at Dragos. My background has just been industrial security work for my career. And we've got Ryan to join us. If you want to introduce yourself, Ryan.
Sure. Ryan Kovar. I'm at Splunk. I'm a distinguished security strategist, and I run a small research team of which David is a part of. And similar to Rob, my whole career before selling out, becoming a vendor, was protecting public sector, but mostly just from nation states and regular IT infrastructure.
And my name's David Bianco. Like Rob said, I'm the special guest star. I prefer to think of myself as the security Pokemon. A wild David appeared.
That's my favorite meme.
Yeah.
Usually there's a pyramid somewhere involved.
Yeah.
But it's a painful point.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Well, with that, I think we can kind of kick off, Phil, if you want to start us off, and then we'll go from there. Also, I find it ironic that you're the moderator. If you want to join in with your decades of experience actually operating electric transmission infrastructure,
ICS, feel free
just a little actual experience there. Feel free to jump in from your perspective as well.
No problem at all. I think a great place to start would be to talk about CHERNOVITE and pipe dream, what's been happening there, and just what we keep learning on that topic.
Perfect. So I'll kick off with that, and I want to put this into context for folks, especially for those of you that are not just drenched in ICS security and living in the community day in day, or just being able to keep up with stuff, because so many folks, even if you're in the community, actually have infrastructure to run, and so you may not be keeping up with all the latest news. So the first kind of public discussions around this was an S4 presentation I did. So if you want to know the deep dive on Pipe Dream and the group behind it, which we call CHERNOVITE, that S4 presentation is out on YouTube. You just look up Pipe Dream and Robert Lee, you'll find it. And it's like an hour-long deep dive into the capability set. This is much more of a panel of what does all of this mean for the community, but that would be your lead into this webinar. The kind of framing here for the larger audience. When we look at the world of industrial security, and sometimes we'll talk about industrial control systems, sometimes we'll talk about an operations technology and OT. When we talk about infrastructure and kind of the critical part of critical infrastructure, those control systems that deal with physics, all right, that is the main driver there. There was a period of our community's history where we were relatively segmented and disconnected. I don't know that we ever truly had air gaps outside of nuclear power sector, but there was a lot of environments that were pretty heavily segmented, mostly disconnected from other networks. And things were very heterogeneous. In my time on the intelligence community side of the house, if I wanted to get involved with a refinery in one part of the world, it would be astronomically different than a refinery, even in the same company in a different part of the world, let alone an entirely different industry like a manufacturing facility or an electric power system. So it was very heterogeneous. So the ability to go after one system and scale that attack to another system, even in the same industry or sometimes same company, was very, very difficult. Different physics, different integration, different vendors, different equipment, everything was different. And so there was a portion of the community's history where I would describe the ICS threats as ICS curious. You had the groups that would break in and do espionage. You'd have everything from the Telvent breach back, 15 years ago to various espionage efforts, even dating into 2012 time frame, where groups were poking and prodding around systems, trying to get into the industrial networks.
Was this because they weren't ICS experts, or they were just kind of going in like, hey, we found an opening. Oh crap, what do we find? I don't understand these protocols.
Yeah, I would say it's largely because they didn't know what they're doing.
Sure.
And so I think there was an interest in some, especially for those of us who've been in the military side of the house, I'm trying to be polite here, but some commanding officer walks in, says, I need you to go after a power grid. I'm like, well, it's not one grid. And how does that, well, you're in charge now. And I'm like, oh shit, and so you're like, okay, what do I look on Wikipedia? What is a power system? What is this? And so there was a lot of that, figure it out phase. And At that time, I would have articulated there was probably 3 state actors outside of US, but 3 that we were tracking back in the intelligence community side of the house that were in that ICS curious phase. And they were getting access to a lot of places and stealing intellectual property, stealing engineering drawings, stealing data storing stuff, things that were useful. And eventually you saw each of those 3 get to a place where they could be disruptive or destructive. And it was still very designed attacks. Even, I can't avoid the S word on the webinar, but even with Stuxnet, that thing worked at that facility in the TAMS.
It was very specifically.
It didn't work anywhere else. You could get infected, but couldn't do the disruptive or destructive effects anywhere else. Then you go and you see Ukraine 2015, very specific to that layout. Technically, you could do it the same style of attack. The TTPs tend to work very well. The tactics, techniques, procedures kind of work everywhere, but capability development for disruptive capabilities, pretty specific. Then you kind of get in the era of crash override or in destroyer where it couldn't be used on any other industries and it couldn't be used in all electric, but it could be pretty widely used in electric transmission and it would work very well there. But it was always this kind of phase of heterogeneous. If you're going to be disruptive, it was very specific. If you want to do espionage, you got to hit a lot of places. And when we were tracking 3, there ended up being 4 that ended up being disruptive and destructive. So we had lack of visibility on one of these state actors that we weren't tracking. Fast forward to today, when I get in front of the community, I don't try to freak people out, and I usually tell people our infrastructure is pretty resilient and safe. Like, you know, you don't
I'm
like
sorry,
send
I couldn't
an
hear you
email.
over living in Texas, but
yeah, no, your Texas electric system may be a little different. There's some wonderful people there though. But long story short, you know, today at Dragos, we track 19 different state actors. And so kind of my forecasting here is, let's not be predictive, but if we were tracking 3 and it ended up being 4 that got to be disruptive, when we're tracking 19 now, the hurricane path is not looking wonderful. So it's not freak out. It's, hey, this couple years in the future, this may be pretty dicey. And in 2018, I testified to the Energy Committee in the Senate and said, hey, within 4 to 5 years, just not being magic here, just based on what we're seeing, within 4 to 5 years, I think we're going to start to get to a place where we have malware for ICS that's scalable beyond its industry. Long story short, this takes us to PIPEDREAM. So what's really changed is not IT-OT convergence. Get those words out of your mouth. Like, stop saying IT-OT convergence. If IT-OT convergence was even a thing, it happened 15 years ago. We've got Windows in the power systems and stuff now. Like, but don't worry about that. Now there's an understanding of dependency and how do we work together and collaborate and break down some silos like you're going to talk about, but largely understand that we have unique mission sets. That, what really is happening though is kind of this digital transformation, industry 4.0, call it whatever your big 4 consultant wants to call it, but hyper connectivity. We are massively connecting up infrastructure while we're digitizing it, and it's very homogenous now. A distributed control system, DCS, or energy management system, or whatever you're talking about now is like cookie cutter into places almost. And you're finding code libraries like Codesys deployed across a bunch of different product lines, all using the exact same versions, or you see common protocols like OPC getting used across to all this different type of equipment. So PIPEDREAM, to me, this long-winded story to bring everyone up to speed, PIPEDREAM to me represents kind of that from ICS curious to ICS disruptive to ICS scalable. We're now in the like scalable attacks era where you could have an ICS cyber attack that impacts one site not only be referenceable in the industry, but cross industry. So PIPEDREAM's initial targeting set had Schneider Electric and Omron devices, but its capabilities were well beyond that. And it could affect hundreds and hundreds of different types of vendors and product lines with the explicit desire to be disruptive, potentially destructive. A lot of physical parameters determine if it can actually be destructive or not. So we've now kind of crossed that Rubicon on, yep, the homogeneous nature's caught up to us at a time the ICS threat landscape is increasing. Now we got to deal with capabilities that can be used at scale across different industries.
So restriction, is that more of a rules of engagement from an adversary rather than a capability function?
Yeah, with PIPEDREAM for sure. There's still, on those 19 actors, if you will, there's still quite a few of them that are in the ICS curious phase that they're trying to get into ICS networks, or some that are in ICS networks and developing capabilities, and there's some that do the capabilities dev. But now that we've seen the level that exists in that CHERNOVITE group, I would say it is demonstrable that you can now have truly cross-industry scalable ICS.
And it's worth the investment from our point of view of R&D, because now it's more than just one attack.
Absolutely. And if I was going to forecast, if I was getting back in front of Congress and forecast where we're going next, as we know in IT security industry as well, any capability that's a state actor capability within like 3 years is a cyber criminal.
What's interesting, it's almost like ICS is a lagging indicator compared to like cloud, because I saw the same exact trend in the more private sector cloud industry, where as people started moving to, oh, we're gonna standardize on Azure, we're gonna standardize on AWS, we're gonna standardize on Office 365. The security in those environments much better than most organizations, but now I only have to research one controls.
Yeah.
And once I get in, once I figure out how to get in there, once I figure out, oh, I don't have to hack Azure, I just have to hack the IAM. I actually just have to hack Rob to get into the, that area. Like there's been a heavy concentration there, but it's just easier. Like now you can pour your money into this.
I think that's a fantastic point where there's pros and cons to this homogeneous nature. And we're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. We don't want to go back to heterogeneous infrastructure, because just for, again, the audience, where the idea that I had to take one engineer and train him on one refinery and move them in my company and had to completely retrain them, it's just unsustainable. So you can't run infrastructure in a heterogeneous way. I see this brought up every time. Phil, you've lived this as well, when people are like, let's just go back to analog. And you say, hold on now, it's not analog. It's
totally,
it's next generation non-digital assets if you want to sell it in front of Congress, not analog. But we can't operate the system that way. So stop pretending. But to your point, there's pros and cons where if you are very homogenous, the ability to train up an ICS security person won't be 10 years to like understand all these different environments, but it's now homogenous where the actors can take advantage of it. And so really it's a race of who can learn the environment faster. And I would tell you that I don't be cynical. I'm very much the defense is doable guy, but the adversary is going to win that one. The adversary has way more purposes of, I need to learn this in comparison to anybody outside of the Fortune like 2000. And so I think there's real societal impact that we'll have to think through, but that's probably outside of the scope.
Because I would almost go, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
like I'd almost say if I were to put on to my, go onto my cyber Tinder app and put in interested in ICS, like the little that I've dabbled my toes in, one of the biggest issues I had was every time I walked to an environment, I'm like, I need to have a good 5 days of you just explaining what the heck you're doing here before I can even tell you where you can start going in. But when I walk into a normal IT environment, I was like, where's your demarc point? What cloud, CSPs are you using? What's your email? Like there's 6 ways an adversary is probably getting your network. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I walk into an OT environment, I'm like, so I'm sorry, what do you, so you have things
what would you say you do here?
Like, what do you, so you have embedded Windows NT 4.0 that's running a hyper virtualized Windows 3.1.1 and you've never rebooted. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
But that lens, before you jump in, that lens, I know you don't do this. It's only the other people that do this, but a lot of, in for a wider audience here, ICS versus IT. First of all, ICS is a made-up term to what he's pointing out. Like it just means not IT, but the difference between ports and how they manage their operations versus electric transmission versus chemical manufacturing versus upstream, downstream, midstream refinery, like everything's different. It's all mission. That's why I always hate when people are like, it's CIA and IT, but it's AIC. No, it's not. It's go learn the mission and the requirements. But to your point that I was going to kind of dive in on there, what in IT though, one of the truisms that I would argue is it tends to be very data focused and very system focused. So if you have a outdated legacy system, if your focus is system and data, that's a big deal. But in operations environment, it's very systems of systems and physics. And so I don't really care that it's a legacy system. Everyone focus, oh, it's vulnerable. Okay, but now make the lights blink. Hell, I'll give you keyboard access and you may not be able to do it. So it puts a different focus on what we want to do for the security of those environments. And usually that's around, what do you have, in my opinion, looking for the tactics and techniques that you actually care about, and kind of thinking about the overall architecture of like, where's the resilience in this system, even if components fail. But David, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say the historic background that you started off with made me actually think that it seems like there's 3 things that are kind of driving this. And that is, first of all, and they all feed on each other, so there's no particular order. And it's, first of all, there's greater acknowledgement in the public eye that there's, that OT even exists, right? And then there's also, over time, because there's greater acknowledgement and there's more people becoming interested in it, the skill sets of both the defenders and sadly the threat actors are actually growing over time. That's contributing to what you were saying, but also the most important probably is that tasking has become much more sophisticated. It is no longer, as you said, sufficient to be like, I want to shut down the towns. It's got to be something like, well, we're going to invest all this money. We want to be able to use it over and over again. And it is not, as you alluded to, it is not out of the realm of possibility that we're going to go past things like state-sponsored kind of goals and taskings and more into industrial espionage and general cybercrime, because we've actually seen these, similar to what you said earlier with, it reminds you of how we went into cloud security. It actually reminds me of how like everything in security has happened. It's like we had this thing when people started hearing about the internet. There was no internet security. I had somebody literally tell me to my face, and it got quoted in the paper, that I was being alarmist, and the reporter said I was a raving paranoid. But guess what?
He's not wrong.
Yeah.
Low column A, low column.
But I mean, it's the same kind of thing. More visibility of internet, more experienced people in internet, more sophisticated taskings over time. So I think, yeah, you're right on track about your predictions, because we have seen those same kinds of evolutions in the past. And it's just now that we're dealing with it at the height of it, probably in OT.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll stop here and kick it back to you, Phil, but I'll round it all the way back on the PIPEDREAM thing. The key, I think, for most people to be aware about PIPEDREAM, without getting into all the specifics that were already covered in the other webinar, we caught it ahead of time with our partners before it was actually employed on targets, meaning it may have been existing somewhere out in the world, but it wasn't on its target. However, we know with high confidence, I should say, we assess with high confidence that the adversary was intending to take down energy infrastructure in the United States, which is pretty crazy on a lot of levels. And so we kind of were actually left of boom for once. Everybody always talks about that left of boom in the military circles, especially, but we actually were for once, which had literal booms, which is kind of odd too, because I have seen some people who are like, yeah, but it didn't attack anybody. Why do I care about this? I'm like, we actually did our job for once, and you're now telling me that you don't care because we did. Like, just focus on this. It is as big of a deal as you could possibly make it out to be without being alarmist about it.
I do know someone, if you want some alarmist opinions, who we can talk to get quoted.
Yeah, obviously the raving. Yeah.
Chicken Little over here.
Yeah. All right. So Phil, with the like 20-minute long, on one question, what other questions? Sorry, Phil.
No problem. You touched on a couple of points there. I mean, we used the convergence word, which we obviously try and avoid, because technically everything has come together for the last 20 years.
Like the first time I got into ICS, I was so confused by this, because I'd always heard everyone's like, ICS Scada, so different, OT, so different. I was like, oh, why are they? Okay, well, this is the, and then I get in there, I'm like, so this is a Windows operating system. They're like, yeah. I was like, and this is somehow completely unique and completely like different threats. So like, well, people can die. I was like, no, I get that part. I get the registers, I get things turning on and off, but like it's controlled by this thing over here. Yeah, I'm like, I'm very comfortable with this. How is this? And you're saying this has been in the OT environments for 30 years?
20, yeah.
I mean, okay. Like,
yeah,
cool, we can do this. Like, we know how to do this.
But again, like everything, so securing it, the ways you secure it, what you're securing it against, and the impact of what you're doing is all different. And so I always love this, where people talk about, well, because you're hitting on a fantastic point. I have this one all the time, even in SANS classes and whatever. And people are like, yeah, but it's Windows operating system. I'm like, okay, got it. But this Windows operating system is doing engineer workstation software that's changing logic on that controller that spins that thing really, really fast. And if the system is the same, even though it's systems of systems, but the threat is different, the security controls are different, the impact is different, how you approach it is different, and how you sustain it is different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then the security answer can't be the same. And so it's one of those like, yeah, it's a very, very valid question. I know you don't have it now, but you did at one point. I think everybody did at one point. But that definitely trips people up with like, a lot of people are like, oh, well, PIPEDREAM, we obviously need to patch our systems. Like, no, it's not taking advantage of like exploits that matter. Okay, well, when you update the system, no, it doesn't actually do anything against this. It's using native functionality and protocols in the environment. Like, yeah, or yeah, deploy antivirus. I'm like, so you want me to deploy antivirus in a way that the OEM is going to tell me to exclude all the files folder paths from the system, and that antivirus was trained in IT environments on IT threats, and you want it to find ICS threats in ICS environments.
Great.
I have responded to more power outages from well-intentioned IT people than Russia, China, Iran combined. You know, it's like one of those things. But Phil, let me kick it back to you. I know this is a very pipe dream focus, but I think there's some interesting components. I'm curious on kind of what you've seen. You were electric operator for decades. I'm interested in kind of how you've seen things change. But before you do that, I will highlight for the audience, and I see the questions starting to roll in. We'll try to get through most of them, except for the ones that are about cyber tender. As I just open up the question mark there.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there you go. And to be inclusive, cyber grinder. But we'll have the whole scheme there. But there's a Q&A button on Zoom. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button. We will actually very likely get to your questions, or at least some of them, depending on how good they are. Everyone always says there's no stupid questions. After teaching SANS for 8 years, there are in fact stupid questions. All right, Phil, so over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, within the energy sector, it's been over 20 years now since we started using Windows engineering workstations. Even the Scada hosts, the HMIs, the communications running over IP networks. So there's the technology convergence obviously has already happened. Where the convergence is still to happen, or is happening more commonly, is in the people. You cannot try and defend these environments just by trying to take OT people and educate them in some security stuff. There's so much skill and knowledge in how you defend those digital systems that comes from the IT world, that you have to bring those two groups together. It just doesn't make sense for one group to think that they have the exclusive rights to securing these environments. The skill sets have to come from both. The constraint is the hardest thing to educate people on, because even if they technically understand the box that they're looking at, they want to try and enable some function on that machine that that will give them better visibility or greater level of control. Them understanding why there's a constraint there that stops them from doing that update, or making even what seems to be a simple configuration change, the amount of time it'll take to do that, the level of rigor and control that somebody will insist on just because of the environment in which that operates is always a challenge. So there's a huge amount of education to deal with there on how do you get people working together across those two teams so that they mutually respect each other's opinions in this area. And there's some great tools to get people working together, because we haven't got that a lot of live fire that you want to throw new groups of people at. So how do we get people thinking about these things in a controlled environment? And it's always interesting to look at how people can develop those skills and how they can start to work together as a team.
That's perfect. And I don't think anybody has ever, I'm sure there's some jerk in the community, but for the most part, if you walk into an infrastructure site and say, hey, I'm here to help, I'm not coming with preconceived notions, I'm not trying to copy and paste our crap into your environment, help me learn about your environment and I'll help you. 99% of the time, everyone's totally cool and comfortable with that. Most people hate it when somebody shows up from IT, they don't know what you're in the business of, you don't know how to what their mission is. And you're like, here's 62443, or here's NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Why aren't you doing all this? And they treat it like a bingo card. Yeah. So just humble, hungry, and you'll end up doing well. But
so I see this the other way as well, Phil, right? Like after PIPEDREAM came out, I had a lot of questions from people, Splunk customers, and they were not OT providers. They were large corporations that suddenly realized their fans were plugged into their network. And this, that goes back to, it goes both sides of this. I think you have traditional network defenders who for the first time are kind of finding out that there is actually data in their network and there's a threat ingress from their network from their actual OT environment that maybe they weren't alerted to. And then they're going, oh crap, how do we defend against this? That demarc point is not where we thought it was. Is this actually a threat to our network?
What I think is really, what I think is really awesome is that the defenders are all on the same mission. Doesn't matter whether their badge says IT or OT. People are trying to work together on solving these things. And absolutely, I think there is a huge amount of respect for people coming from the IT space, asking the right respectful questions of what's going on in the OT environment, not jumping to conclusions in the same way as maybe people were doing 10 years ago, where they just look in and say, you guys don't know what you're doing, because this is clearly insecure. That's changing, really is changing.
That previous conversation, when I kind of went through like, how do I defend a Windows box, and a very patient OT defender kind of said, great, and if you install something and it blue screens, what happens? And I said, oh, I re-image the machine. And of course for him, he was like, yeah, when I blue screen this, we lose this and people die, possibly, or maybe not, but either way, this happens and there's a kinetic impact. And I was like, oh, we get a new Dell. Like, this is a...
I commonly tell people that no one has ever died because somebody joined a database in IT, but we literally have had an example where people died in a pipeline explosion because an IT administrator joined two databases on an OT environment, which caused a lag on the system, which meant the operator didn't get the critical alarms off of the pipeline. And so it wasn't the root cause, but it was definitely a component of it. Yeah. And there's a very seriousness in our field. But circling back to PIPEDREAM of some sorts, I'm sure, to make sure we get to the webinar focus. Phil, anything you want to ask or drive us back on schedule?
No, it's sort of thinking on those, when you've got those groups of people, how can they practice these skills? How can IT people practice those skills in the OT environment? How can they practice their teamwork and make sure that they're ready, to act as a single team when trying to deal with an incident, should it occur?
Yeah, well, we've done a little bit of this. So we had something a couple of years ago. I went to Rob's other house, his office, and we did a boss of the SOC, which is a CTF that I created at Splunk. It's now gone on to great fame and acclaim, at least in my opinion. And we did a very specific ICS scenario on the Dragos brewery, which was quite a bit of fun. And I learned how to turn registers and coils on and off, and I broke things, and Tom yelled at me. It was a lot of fun. And then earlier this year, we actually stood up bots.splunk.com, and Dragos was, I think, our first partner actually to participate in that. And we have a lot of great data up there. You can just go to bots.splunk.com for free and actually log on and play around with data that you're probably not going to get a lot of other places in a very stress-free environment for once.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just posted a link in the chat as well for those of you that are live. It's a collection of resources for getting started in ICS/Scada cybersecurity, because it was written back when people still referred to it that way. And I update it every now and then, but for those of you that aren't on the chat and you're watching this in the future, just Google getting started in ICS Robert Lee and you'll find it. It's a page of a bunch of free resources for getting started, obviously, as the title would allude. And what I usually try to focus people on is don't focus on the security stuff to start with. Focus on
terminology.
Yeah, exactly. Terminology and how does a wastewater treatment process work? What's the mission of an electric transmission site?
Learning that what you thought were the commonly known protocols are not the common protocols.
For sure. And so all that's there. Then I would tell you the CTFs are huge. Like, that's one of the reasons we invest in it with Splunk, is I think it's extraordinarily educational. I would be a major proponent of what he was just discussing. There's also at SANS, we do an ICS CTF every year that's completely free and available out to the community. And then OT Cert. So we launched something called Dragos Ot Cert, and that's completely free for any of the asset owners and operators. Basically, if you work at an infrastructure company, you can go get access, and it's targeted towards smaller providers, but anybody can join it, and it has like free training and videos and all sorts of stuff to be helpful for folks about getting started in ICS. But once you get to the terminology, once you do the CTFs, probably the best opportunity is going down, case of beer, box of donuts, go talk to your operators and get intertwined with the business.
That's not suspicious at all, showing up on the doorstep with a kid.
But if you're like, I'm from IT and I brought goodies, like I've never seen anybody turn that down. So it helps.
No, I just usually give them USBs. So like, here's some free branded Splunk USBs. Just plug them in, like free resources.
They'll love that.
Everyone loves that.
That's great. So I think that's a good way to get started, Phil. And again, what I would, going back to the whole PIPEDREAM thing, I would note that, each company, sometimes, and there's like 50 questions already about like standards and which standard do you want and so forth and so on. And I will tell you, it doesn't really matter. I don't care if it's 62443, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, C2M2, CMMC, name your flavor. Doesn't matter. Stop treating them like bingo cards. Instead of going down control, instead look at what are the risks at your company that you want to mitigate, figure out the right controls for those, and then map them back to the standard, because each of the standards is just a common lexicon, just like MITRE ATT&CK. You don't play bingo with it. Here's a way for me to communicate these tactics and techniques to others. And I would tell you that every company largely should be focused on, at first, the scenarios that have happened in their community. scenarios are really, really good to plan for because your board does a lot of scenario planning. Your operators and engineers usually do like HAZOps and safety kind of scenario planning. Cybersecurity is a lot of kill chain kind of analysis, scenario planning. Go pick a scenario. If you're an electric power company, you better have 2015 Ukraine, 2016 Ukraine, and ransomware covered.
Let's pull that thread then.
Yeah.
If someone was going to tabletop or role play through PIPEDREAM and say like, okay, this capability existed, where would you start? Where would you tell people to start? If you're concerned about this threat, start off.
Yeah, and so absolutely, where I was going with that was PIPEDREAM is a one of the ransomware and PIPEDREAM would be the two that are, regardless of whatever industry you're in,
That,
you should definitely be thinking about it.
For the buzzwords.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I haven't mentioned AI and blockchain yet, but we can get there. I always have that too. People will be like,
on Cyber Tinder?
oh yeah, no, they're like, by the way, I don't have an inventory, I don't know what's in my environment, and I don't have any logs. What do I do with AI? I'm like, nothing. Like just
secure it with your blockchain.
Yeah, start somewhere else. But also, my favorite thing, just as an aside, one of our account managers, there was like an RFP of like, do you have AI? And he was like, yes. And they asked him about it. He's like, actual intelligence. And I was like, oh, I love it. Anyways, so for PIPEDREAM, one of the things that I think is important about PIPEDREAM to recognize is it's just the capability and effects team. It's not the access team. So you're not going to see CHERNOVITE trying to get access to your network. It would be any one of the other groups they work with or somebody else. CHERNOVITE's the team they hand it off to once they're in the ICS to then go do their actual effects. And PIPEDREAM's capability, if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework, you'll find that PIPEDREAM, I think, covers like 37% of all known TTPs in it. Like it's so flexible, which makes it like perfect kind of tabletop scenario. What I would say in terms of the tabletop scenario is to recognize that PIPEDREAM is not one malware. It's actually like 4 or 5 different pieces of malware. It's a framework. So you would end up taking kind of the threads off of it. Okay, if we wanted to look at a capability that was proxying through PLCs to do east-west, what would we look at? If we're looking at the capability to do a modification on a safety system, what would it look like? But I think it's a very effective way to tabletop. I would kick it back over to you though, as we see kind of, we care when they're already in an OT network. From a Dragos perspective, I'm sorry, I'm sure someone cares about your IT network. Splunk as an example, I don't. I want you to do it. I'm glad you do it. I don't care about your printer or anything that happens over there. The moment it crosses into OT, I'm all gung-ho, but that's where our specialty is. And so CHERNOVITE and PIPEDREAM are in OT. Great, here's what you do. But there's a lot of IT stuff. What are you kind of seeing in some of the more common access development things happening lately and things that you could see at industrial companies?
It's an interesting question because one of the things I've enjoyed most over this last year, my team did a piece of research led by Shannon Davis, one of the guys on our team, around ransomware encryption speeds. And we did a literature review before we started research, as we do for everything, and tried to find an area of interest. And a lot of people have written a lot about the different ransomware groups. And a lot have talked about Bitcoin and how they're paid, but they hadn't worked on the ransomware speed. And that was interesting, no point for this call. What was interesting was then we found this great white paper by CERT New Zealand, which was the life cycle of ransomware. And what I found fascinating was it was exactly the same as APT filtering. And everything comes into intrusion and intrusion access brokers. And the reality is this is starting to get commoditized and everything is kind of blending together. And nation state, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I got into the industry, like it was intrusions were done by the tier 1 help desk of the APT actor. Now I kind of wonder, like, why would you bother doing it? Like, if I was running a nation state team, I would actually just say like, hey, here's $100 grand, go buy some access at a company that we're interested in that's not attributed to me, and bring back the access point.
No one would ever do that. There are like black hat vendors now that specialize in a certain piece of the kill chain. And just like on the defense side, we specialize in certain pieces of the defense. You could create an entire threat actor group basically by writing checks or sending Bitcoin, I guess, whatever.
This is like we're going so far off ICS, but I'm so glad you guys are here. I'm sorry for the entire audience, but we're just going to geek out for a minute. This is where I get super frustrated on the grouping and clustering. People are like, that group is China, that group is Russia. I'm like, stop. There's infrastructure teams, there's malware development teams, there's vulnerability exploit teams, there's access development teams, there's effects teams, there's analysis teams. Once you get on, you could be talking about 8 different teams from multiple states and vendors, and you just called it.
And that's just
and you just called it one name.
We ran into this subsection because we started looking at ransomware, And people are like, oh, let's look at Lockbit. I was like, cool, what is Lockbit? And they're like, well, the ransomware family. I was like, well, it's not, do you mean the malware? Do you mean the malware author? Do you mean the ransomware as a service? Or do you mean the people who actually committed the attack using the binary that was given to them by a third party that was actually buying it from a second party?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I was like, because those are all different. And the guy who's targeting you may have bought the intrusion access from another vendor. And it's like, because we're not saying APT, people are treating these differently, but it's, hey, you just got off of work. What are you doing? Oh, I'm going to go work my second job at the coalface. Like that job just happens to be ransomware. And yeah,
and it matters in terms of how you defend it, because it'd be very easy to be like, this is all, elitism, CTI, cyber threat intelligence, whatever discussions. And it's like, no, I mean, actually, if it's this group, it's these TTPs, if it's this, it's that. Otherwise, it just all over time becomes this amorphous blob, like, I don't know, Lazarus Group. And then all of a sudden you have no idea how to, well, are you talking about Lazarus Group in 2008? Are you talking about the TTPs in terms of 2015? Are you talking about the one that, yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the reasons, not saying anybody's perfect, and surely we're not either, but that's one of the reasons we're like, here's PIPEDREAM and here's CHERNOVITE, which is a cluster of the TTPs leveraged. We're not doing attribution on it. I don't really care. Here is how you defend against this.
Yeah, we need to do a better job of moving past just the technical indicators, which, yeah, technical indicators right now for some of these things can be all over the place.
Which would imply there's some like levels of like pain to the adversary, to which you move up.
In a hierarchical,
yeah, like a pyramid at a pointy top. No, but even past that, in the pyramid of pain, the top level is the behaviors, but even past that, there's goals and tasking. That turns out to be critically important when you are trying to attribute things, but we don't really like to talk about that much, I guess, on the technical, at least on the IT security side, because most of us don't understand the actual discipline of CTI enough to talk about it at that level.
The conflation of threat data and threat intelligence, if I have one pet peeve, it's just like, one is actionable data that I can put a defense in that's already out of date. Doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. It just means like, this is an observed thing. And the other is how this came into being. And like, I love threat intel reports. I love threat data, but do not conflate the two into the same thing.
I always complain in class when people are like, is it actionable intel? I'm like, if it's inactionable, it's not intel. Like it's you're conflating words. But to your point on and then we'll come back to PIPEDREAM, Phil, to your point on David, on the indications and like tasking, this is what, in my opinion, some people get the most wrong about the kill chain. Like when Klopp and Hutch and them sat down to write that, the reconnaissance phase was not scans in their website. It was actually to indicate that you don't have visibility into somebody walking into some military or intelligence community's office going, hey, here's your tasking and here's why you're doing this. And it was kind of this, sure, you can put some data there if you want, but really it's a reminder that you don't have visibility into the initial phases of the adversary's operations.
Well, what's the phrase? Like, all models are broken, but some models are useful, right? So, okay. As a creator of a model, I understand that I also did not explicitly bring that out. But that's only because, the pyramid of pain is about incident detection. Yeah. And you can't detect goals or taskings, really. That I don't pretend to actually be a cyber threat intelligence expert. I know how to use it for good detection and response and threat hunting and things like that. But I do know at least that, those things exist and they're critically important, just not for the kinds of things that, most incident detection people or incident responders like to do. But we are mostly the people who are involved in making like cyber threat intelligence purchasing decisions. So,
well, and I would say, like, I got a lot of questions after Russia invaded Ukraine, and they said, "Oh, cyber war is about to break out." I was like, "Well, kind of already, okay, but we'll go ahead." Like, what do you mean? They're like, "Oh, we thought there was going to be explosions everywhere." I was like, "Right, but like you've read the news, right? You see what's happened. Like, there's been actual predictive stuff on this. Like, we got ahead of this left of boom in certain areas, and like people are doing a lot of work here." But part of this goes back to the intel side of it, of like understanding the rules of engagement, understanding what people are doing and how and why, which ties directly into PIPEDREAM, because then you go into, if somebody has what I believe the buyer line was Swiss Army knife malware for IT or OT, like, what do you do with this? What are the capabilities? I mean, there's another cognitive thought model there, right? The diamond model going into, I have these capabilities, what am I going to do? You're not going to develop capabilities unless they map up with the victimology that you're trying to attack. and you have the reason to do so. So that all nicely ties together. When you're doing these threat modeling, you're looking at this malware that is all over the place, but it has to be introduced. Like, can I stop this malware if it's in my OT environment? Maybe not once it's already there. Can I detect it before it gets onto that environment? Hell yeah, you can, but it takes a lot of work and elbow grease.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
I was just going to, we there's a couple of questions in around how we do that, and I mean, we've got one in here around whether threat intel is actually is it usable within the ICS environment? Is it accurate? I think absolutely, but it is understanding that the context of ICS and OT threat intelligence is different. It's about the how. It's understanding what the objectives are, and some of the the tactics, techniques, the procedures are not necessarily just chasing IOCs, which for all the reasons you discussed, I think are aren't always something that you can look for when an attack is particularly targeted on. It's not necessarily going to be reused. But it's we've got a couple of things in as well around detection. How can certainly back to the points you made around AI and blockchain. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about whether can machine learning and AI be used to detect threats in these spaces. The answer is on its own, probably not, because you need that threat intelligence. You've got to have that understanding of what the adversary is going to do, and that's one of the reasons why when to address another question in here, when you're making you have got engineers who are making changes in the environment. If you have to keep just baselining looking for change as an indicator of threat, you're not going to find the adversary operating within your space. What you need to look for is what the adversaries do within your environment. Not just look for something that's changed. Otherwise, you're just going to keep chasing your engineers around in circles. You're going to be chasing changes in ICS protocol, which just happened due to normal operations. A typical substation, you're not going to see within the first 3 or 4 years of operation every single possible goose message that might occur within that site, unless somebody's going to fully recommission the substation. So understand the adversary and how they operate is super important.
My experience, ICS and Scada environments tend to be much more static than IT environments. And so I would have assumed, apparently incorrectly, that something like, and I'm going to say this, that it's AI when you pitch to Silicon Valley, it's machine learning when you talk to your board of directors, and it's statistics when you talk to an actual person doing the job. But to me, it feels like I would have been able to baseline a lot more accurately in an OT environment. Are you saying that's not the case?
It's deterministic. You can absolutely baseline the physical assets. People don't come in regularly and change or add dozens of PLCs, but they do add them. You go into any manufacturing facility, people are adding new lines all of the time. They're adding new equipment on the end of that line to further improve their efficiencies. So new assets get added, and understanding those new assets and making sure that they are what you expect them to be, and they aren't something that's being just plugged into the network. That's a great thing to baseline, the physical assets that you have on your network. But trying to baseline all of the telemetry within that network is very, very difficult, because it just takes decades to physically build a statistical model that's accurate enough to represent something as complex as a moving machine. And the power grid is a phenomenally complicated system, but as are all things that wear, all things that change. And there are reasons why in some environments the engineers are constantly changing things. It's because they're always adjusting the time that a lubrication pump runs, the amount of time it takes for a sensor to trip on a certain function, because the machine is physically changing as it ages, and that's a really complex thing to baseline.
Yeah, entropy wins. But here's another reason to kind of pile on with Phil's comments here. If you were looking for indicators of compromise of PIPEDREAM, it's probably super ineffective, because it's still, even though it'll scale, they're still going to manipulate things, and it's going to change based on the environment they want to target. If you're looking for the tactics and techniques of PIPEDREAM, it's actually quite reliable. Here's the TDPs, this is what you look for. It's difficult to change, but also it's a combination of events, right? Event 1 plus event 2 plus event 3 happen within the 60-minute window. Therefore, it's riskier and worth investigation. Anomalies tend to be, here's an event that's anomalous, and you're in essence generating a lot of answers to questions you're not asking. So here's a bunch of answers, here's a bunch of anomalies, but then the analyst has to go back and add all the context. And the analysts, especially in this space, that don't know a lot about ICS go, I don't know. And they're constantly calling up the operator. Have you seen this anomaly? Have you seen this anomaly? Have you seen this anomaly? And you're going to piss off the operators while they're trying to run operations, and you're not going to have any questions to answer. Analytics, looking for DDPs, is essentially questions and then the answer. And so what most people get caught up on is, yeah, but I might miss something. I want to detect the unknown unknowns, which is very much where anomalies are. And it should actually be a lot more of hunting and going outside of that. But in IT security, we've built up levels of automation and layers of signature-based and TTB-based and indicators and whatever now to get to the point of adding in some anomalies in ML could be really helpful at scale. In ICS, we're still at the, forget the unknown unknowns. I'd like to know if you have TeamViewer on the HMI. Let's start there. Or could you even understand that somebody's manipulating your logic during a runtime operations? Like, we aren't at the known knowns to even begin seriously discussing the unknown unknowns. And so I don't come at it from an ML or AI is bad. I come at it usually from a, you're not doing the things that we can control and get predictable value out of. Let's start there, then open up the discussion where you want to go from there. And the things that we're talking about, especially for like TDPs and similar, is the same things going to audit operational resilience. Can you detect that somebody is modifying a digital relay on an electric substation during operations? That's going to be a network telemetry thing, understand the ICS protocols, DMP3, 104, whatever. And you're going to be able to do that. Sure, you're going to add that in for, can I detect that happened from an attack? But that can just happen from an operations, integration, maintenance, insight, or whatever perspective. And being able to go to operations and go, oh, you had a trip on the system, and here's why, is invaluable root cause analysis for them just to maintain operations. And then you can add, this was malicious or not. And that's context. And that's context a machine learning model will never provide you.
Well, I think a lot of people, when it comes to detection with machine learning and AI and whatever buzzwords, a lot of people really don't really think about all the asymmetries that this whole gavotte between network defenders and OT defenders and cyber criminals and espionage and other threat actors. They're this complex dance that they're going through. There's a lot of asymmetries in it. And one of the asymmetries, the specific one that's relevant to this part of the discussion, is that you would essentially be asking a automated system to be good at countering unpredictability in human threat actors. Because, I mean, humans, you think of the threat actors, their whole business is tricking us, deceiving us, lying to us. And computers just are not good at that. They probably never will be good at that, except in maybe regimented programs. But that's not the case here. Like, if you think of your typical OT environment, there's a lot of different pieces that play together, and it's hard even to get your head around all of those a lot of times. And so just being like, throwing it over to AI and ML, just saying, if your threat actors are lying to you and you already know it's hard for another human to detect when they're lying and tricking you, how in the world do you expect a computer to do it? Now, you can definitely have the AI and the ML help you, but if you're going to counter hands-on keyboard human threat actors, you still need human incident detection, response, threat hunting to help augment your automated detections. You need the automated detections to scale, but you need the humans to kind of direct that to make sure that you're being effective.
That ties into something you were talking about, Phil, right? Like this, once again, when you have IT and OT together, and like for PIPEDREAM, it has to come in over an IT network primarily. And it's, if I remember correctly, has C2s, right? People are communicating, they're doing things back and forth. That probably goes over your IT network. Having a single place for people to kind of look through that and correlate information, it may be much easier for your traditional network defenders to actually find an OT threat happening in the IT environment than on the OT network itself. That's the Chris Duffy and others on our Splunk. They created, like, I think it's the OT add-on, OT security add-on to go into enterprise security, our SIM tool, because they're like, oh, this is one place where people have a different view of these different data sources coming in and taking a look at this at a larger angle than just isolated, like, I look at OT threats here, I look at IT threats here. That's not how malware and the world works today.
Absolutely, and that's why your threat intelligence needs to think about that stage one, and keep focused on it. And there's a great question in around, has anybody seen the deployment of CrowdStrike in an ICS environment cause a failure? Don't be thinking about putting an EDR tool down at that level until you're really, really certain that you've got a secure and architecture that
and it's not a
allows you to
CrowdStrike
do
specific
it.
thing. It's not a CrowdStrike specific thing, to be
It's
fair
not
to CrowdStrike.
any EDR tool. But what you can do is you can do some awesome things looking for the TTPs, stage one attacks that of some of these adversaries in your IT environment, looking for ICS specific threats in your IT environment. There's no better tool than than
back to
that.
what we said earlier, the nice thing there is you don't have to do extra work. Like the things you're doing to hunt for adversaries that are in your IT network for that stage one is exactly the same as the adversaries you're looking for who are going to pivot in the OT network. And oh, by the way, they're exactly the same as modern ransomware gangs. They're all the same TTPs for the first stages, the first intrusions. Like you can really get a lot of bang out of your buck.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is, as we start moving into the questions anyways, again, talking about PIPEDREAM, if you can't detect the lateral movement, east and west traffic inside of an ICS environment, then you're not going to detect ransomware. You're not going to detect PIPEDREAM. But there was a lot, when I got up on stage and talked about PIPEDREAM, I mentioned to folks, hey, if you listened to us 7 years ago, that you should be doing this. 5 years ago, here's an OPC module and crash override and so forth and so on. Like if you just look at all the things we've been advising on the long, and you actually had prevention, detection, and response against those, PIPEDREAM was just a blip on the radar for you. Because one of the things that was interesting about PIPEDREAM is it took kind of the best hits of all these different capabilities. The OPC module had a crash override, but made better. The lateral movement work that Stuxnet was doing, but made better. Like if you just took piece by piece by piece of all the other families, PIPEDREAM just learned from the adversaries. And if you've been focusing on TTPs, not patching and indicators, you were in a really good place, actually. But if you hadn't been doing that, now you're very behind. Yeah. And I think this goes to the EDR discussion and similar. There's a lot of host-based focus in IT because of the powerful tooling of EDRs and similar, but that's a very data and system. In ICS, it's network for a reason because you need to see system-to-system interactions. Then you can do, alerting and similar on a host level if you want, but being candid, antivirus and EDR would not be a top 5 control for me in ICS. It's not a bad control, but it wouldn't be the first 5 things I do.
And I think that's a great pivot. Yeah, actually, in that we've got a question, and probably can finish off on this one and get each of yours views on it. The questions around what would our recommendations be for a third world country. I think what are our recommendations regardless of the country, what would be the top 5 controls that you would implement in these environments?
Yeah, and you're right, it does lean a lot of these when there's people asking about best practices, people talking about what standards and similar. So here's how I'd view it, and please feel free to jump in. I'll try to make mine as short as possible. I do like being risk-based. And so I don't like when people get in these almost religious arguments of, is encrypting a protocol good or bad? Well, I don't like it in ICS, but let's not talk about, I don't like it and it's a good or bad control. It's what are we trying to reduce the risk against? And is this effective or not in comparison to other options? So what I like is pick a scenario, because you can communicate into boards on down to operations, on over to security. Of, again, electric company, 2015, 2016 Ukraine, ransomware, maybe PIPEDREAM. Oil and gas company, better have crisis scenario, better have ransomware scenario. Like you can go down the list of what your 2 or 3 scenarios would be for your company, map out the whole view, make sure you cover prevention, detection, and response, because a lot of the standards are very prevention focused. Like 95% of 62403 is prevention focused, access management, segmentation, antivirus, patching, et cetera. So you never detect and respond to anything. Anyways, pick those scenarios. So my first control, my top 5, first control, incident response plan specific to ICS, factoring in those scenarios, which leads to the second control, which is a defensible architecture. We can debate what a defensible architecture is, or you can go back to whatever the scenario is and need to figure out what is the collection I'm going to need for the incident response, what is the collection I'm going to need for detection, what is my ability to prevent some of the silly stuff I don't want to deal with. Does this architecture actually support the incident I want to get to? Our common finding is people have incidents after doing all this work, but never thinking about the incident. And so it's just not aligned. Just reverse engineer the incident and help guide your program. The third control for me is then the network monitoring, the stuff admittedly we do at Dragos on the Dragos platform technology side, help you get visibility into your inventory, detect threats, respond, vulnerabilities, things like that. But the reason I like that as a control is its first job is to reinforce that architecture, because very often people have a good architecture at one point in time, but it just atrophies over time. The any firewall rule that stays forever, or the wireless access mode or whatever. So reinforce that, And don't focus on anomalies, focus on the TTPs that actually map to the ones that are in that scenario. And I should have run books and everything for the SOC analyst on how do I deal with that. And I would bring it all up into Splunk. And then I could pivot back down into the Dragos platform as I need to investigate with environmental context. And there's a Splunk Dragos app as well. Look at all that pitching. But anyways, the fourth control for me would be secure remote access. There's a question about MFA already in here. I think MFA is a phenomenal control for remote access, truly remote. Honeywell, GE, Emerson, somebody's remoting in, integrator, OEM, whatever. Yes, please have multi-factor authentication. That inside the network, I don't really see the value as a significant control, but if it maps into your defensible architecture against your IR plans, feel free. And then the fifth one is a key vulnerability management program. In our analysis, about 96% of the vulnerabilities, just really not worth your time in ICS. Those 4% though, you better take care of them pretty quickly. They're being exploited by adversaries or they're adding unique risk into ICS. A lot of the other ones are vulnerabilities that the functionality is already there, resident in the system. You don't need the vulnerability to do what you're accomplishing, so it's kind of pointless. So I don't want you chasing around vulnerabilities all over the place. I want you to be able to go to operations and say, hey, we're going to keep 96% of this crap off your plate. But when we come to you, it's about these 4%, and we need to really take care of that, like a remote code execution vulnerability on a data historian that can bridge the IT-OT divide. That's a big deal. But a vulnerability on a digital relay that allows you to reprogram it when that's the entire function of the engineer workstation anyways, it's probably not all that useful for you. You do those 5 things, you are in a world-class OT security program. Don't get into the let's do 20 or 30 things, you peanut butter spread it and you never get anything done. Because another truism about our field is in IT, you might have one giant IT network. Sometimes you have multiple, but you might have one giant IT network. Every OT network at every site is different. So you end up having like 167 OT networks. Don't think you can just treat it all like the same thing. Anyways, your thoughts?
I'll be very boring here and do an overarching. For me, the single biggest thing I always tell people to work on, regardless of OT or IT, is a qualitative risk assessment. Like not necessarily knowing what you're facing and knowing what your most valuable assets are, and also what the biggest risks are. You know, just what like Rob said, like in terms of the, you know, we have 100 vulnerabilities, but only 4% of them actually make a problem for us. Like that is a sophisticated area to be able to put your resources towards somewhere valuable. But where I see people fail is they don't like the word qualitative, and they don't like the word risk, and they don't like the word assessment. It's too big to broad. So I usually start with a scenario and then kind of work down. And the best scenarios I've ever found are previous incidents. So I love making people tabletop. Okay, this incident happened. What have we done since then to prevent this from ever occurring again? And then also taking real world other people's incidents and tabletopping that with a qualitative risk assessment. And I'll turn over to you for the last 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm trying hard not to invoke Sun Tzu because I think
Well,
this
now
whole thing about
bingo?
knowing yourself is actually the first step. Is you actually need to do, I won't say asset discovery and asset management, because I think those have a big negative connotation now among a lot of people, and it's not sexy and whatever.
Our customers have done it. Look at that.
But I will say, like, so a friend of mine, Chris Sanders at Applied Network Defense, he likes to call this friendly intelligence. I prefer that term as well. So we are talking all the time about cyber threat intelligence. What are the adversaries doing? But, you know, understanding what things are on your network, what their roles are, who your users are, what the applications are, what the communications patterns look like. Understanding your own network is a key. And it can be free or very low cost. You don't have to go out and buy a product. Sorry to everyone on this call, but you can actually do that for, you know, yourself. Once you have that information, then you are ready to start engaging with your peers and other people in your industries and your vendors to say, like, okay, I understand my own operating environment. What is the threat environment that I'm actually part of? Then you can start looking for like incident detection, incident response, you know, all the cyber protection stuff and OT protection stuff that gets us out of bed in the morning has to kind of go behind all this, maybe less.
So know what you want to defend, prioritize what you want to defend, and then work through it with a plan.
Well, and also I would say know what you're up against.
There you go.
Yeah.
No, I think that's very fair. And like, actually, it's one of the things I think will end on a positive note for ICS is I think IT security had abdicated and actually divorced asset knowledge from threat detection.
Yes.
It was very different. The way we're approaching it in ICS, partly because of the vendors like us, partly because that's just what the community is asking for, is out of the gate combining them. I don't want to run all those threat analytics for TDPs against every piece of equipment, but on the controllers that are operating the gas turbine, here's what you could do. Therefore, this matters differently.
Right.
So this idea of let's actually have an asset inventory and let's actually really understand that's very inherent to engineering. And it's very useful in context of, does this detection matter or not? And so I think ICS security in many ways is going to teach IT security about asset management, asset discovery, and kind of context aware detections, while we'll learn plenty from IT security on response and kind of the preventative controls aspect and similar. I think it'll end up being a really good overall marriage.
Great.
And right
Thank
on
you.
the dot.
Boom.
Right, and where we are at the top of the hour. And so thank you very much for our audience. Thanks very much. But special thank you to our panelists for a very engaging conversation. And yeah, great. Thank you very much, everyone. We will follow up with all of you who've been on the call and try and get through any of your questions.
I got to get on that.
Yeah. The ending of Cyber Tender.
Yeah.
Anyways, yep. Dragos, Splunk, doing cool things. Go check it out. We've tried not to just do like the technology integration and be like, we're partners, but actually do community and education stuff. So there's a million questions over here that we can get to about education. There's a ton of stuff we're doing together, and you go check it out. But anyways, thanks, Phil. Thanks y'all for randomly coming into my house to have the webinar. And
You didn't even invite us. We
just showed up. So that's good.
Awkward.
Good friends. Yeah, that's nice. All right, y'all take care. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.